Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking on something uh, pretty ambitious, one of the biggest projects we've ever faced in one of these deep
It's
dives.
a big one.
Yeah, we're going to trace the complete sweeping trajectory of the covenant community. Our listener has sent in a body of sources that, well, they fundamentally reinterpret the entire history of the Old Testament.
Right, and they argue there isn't just one story, there are two.
Two distinct, often conflicting streams flowing right from creation all the way to the eve of the New Testament.
Exactly, and this isn't just, a history lesson, it's a structural critique.
We've kind of hinted at this before, haven't we?
We have. In our deep dives on figures like Job and Jonah, remember we saw that critique aimed at later Judaism? It's exclusivism and its focus on individual reward.
Yeah, that transactional view of faith.
Well, to understand why those critiques are so powerful, you really need this overarching framework.
A whole picture.
That's our mission today. To provide that whole picture, we're going to trace how the concept of the law and the covenant defined and, ultimately fractured ancient Israel.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we're doing a total structural overhaul of the Old Testament narrative, we have to start at the absolute beginning. And according to these sources, that is not Moses on Mount Sinai. It's Genesis.
It is creation itself. We have to start there to truly define what the sources mean by the law.
Okay.
So when we read the creation narrative, what it's doing is establishing the proper place and manner of existence for absolutely everything.
So like a fixed inherent order, the rules the cosmos runs by.
Precisely.
The sun rules the day, the moon rules the night, water flows downhill, certain animals eat certain things. That kind of fundamental structure.
Exactly. That inherent fixed order is what the sources are defining as natural law. And right there, that's the first massive reinterpretation.
How so?
Because in Scripture, this natural law, this operating system of reality, is the same thing as the law.
Wow. Okay, so the law isn't just a set of ethical rules handed down later.
No. It's the fundamental operating principle of reality itself. It governs the stars in human conduct.
That dramatically changes the traditional understanding of the law. It shifts it from, a book of rules to an embedded cosmic truth.
It does.
So if the law is creation structure, where does the covenant fit in?
Well, they're inseparable. The law is also known as covenant law.
Okay.
There's a theologian referenced in the material, Karl Barth, who puts it beautifully. He says creation is the outward, the external evidence of the covenant.
Right.
And the covenant is the internal truth of creation. They're two sides of the same coin.
So the very act of creating sets up a contract, a relationship.
A covenant relationship, yeah. And it's built on this inherent law.
Okay, let's bring that huge cosmic scope down to us, to humanity. If the universe has its law, what was the specific law given to people?
That's represented in the story of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
The famous tree.
It's a religious representation, a symbolic story. But the core idea is that ability to distinguish between right and wrong, good and evil, that's exclusive to humanity.
Right, you don't judge a wolf for hunting.
You don't.
Yeah.
That ability, that internal sense of moral order, is synonymous with conscience.
And the fall, then? When humanity breaks that law,
Yeah.
that moment of divergence, what exactly did we lose?
This is critical.
Yeah.
Humanity didn't lose the knowledge of good and evil. That knowledge is now, permanent.
It stuck with us.
Right. But they lost the ability to perfectly follow their conscience,
Yeah.
to live fully within the law. And the immediate consequence, represented by the curse of hard labor,
Yeah.
was that they were no longer managers of the natural world. They became subject to it, subjugated by the very creation they were supposed to oversee.
So after this cosmic failure, the path to restoration wasn't some massive global reset.
No, not at all.
It was through a very specific call to individuals who still wanted to live by the covenant.
Exactly. God sought restoration by calling those who still had that internal desire to live by the covenant. This starts with Abraham,
Okay.
lineage Isaac, Jacob, Israel. It represents the succession of those who consciously carried this fervent desire, this internal commitment. It wasn't just a biological birth line.
And this all leads us to the Sinai covenant, the moment Israel becomes a nation with a specific job description. What was that job?
Their mission was singular, to live a holy life that would demonstrate true faith to the rest of the world.
But what does holy life mean here? Because the sources are very specific.
They are. It was intensely practical, not just, spiritual. It meant establishing a society with no distinction of status, rank, or wealth.
No distinction at all.
None. It was meant to be a community characterized by economic equity, where everyone lived prosperously and happily. that vision of social and economic justice. That's the very foundation of the Sinai contract.
That is a demanding definition of holiness. I mean, it's not just about prayer. It's about eliminating the ancient equivalent of the 1% versus the 99%.
Precisely. And this is where the trouble begins. This is what leads to the two streams that compete throughout the rest of Israel's history.
Okay, so Stream A.
Stream A represents the prophetic tradition. It emphasizes the spirit of the Sinai covenant, that social justice and equity are paramount. This stream points directly toward the gospel's ultimate fulfillment of the law. We'll call it the green path.
And Stream B, the purple path, runs parallel, and I take it undermines Stream A.
Completely. Stream B focused heavily on the tabernacle, the temple, ritual sacrifice.
The external stuff.
The external stuff, yeah. It often misinterpreted earlier texts from Exodus and Leviticus that dealt with worship. This tradition basically suggested that rituals were sufficient to please God.
And that created a massive loophole.
A huge one. It allowed for the retention of social inequity, status differences, wealth distinctions, as long as you check the box on the sacrifice schedule.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and I think, frankly, shocking for a lot of people.
I think so.
Because we are traditionally taught that the monarchy, specifically King David, was the high point of faith. But this source material just completely flips that script.
It's the point of catastrophic failure. The sources argue the fatal turn happened when the king and priest colluded. The monarchy, established by Saul but really cemented by David, created this centralized power structure. It was all focused on the royal house and the physical temple.
So the message shifted.
It shifted from live justly, which is Stream A, to just offer sacrifices at the temple, and your prosperity is guaranteed. That's Stream B.
So David is presented here not as a faithful model,
Yeah.
but as the figure who essentially ruined Israel's faith.
He's the model who ruined it, yes. He solidified the system that prioritized the temple and the dynasty over the demanding radical justice of the covenant.
Wow.
By centralizing worship and power, he created the conditions for Stream B to just thrive. And this fundamental failure to uphold the covenant of equity, that's what led directly to the national division, the oppression of the poor, and eventually the exile.
And this ritual-only approach where you try to buy divine favor with animal sacrifice while ignoring human suffering, that's exactly what the prophets were so angry about.
They were furious.
They didn't see it as sincere worship.
No, they condemned it as adopting pagan or idolatrous worship methods, where sacrifices are transactional. The covenant God doesn't need to be appeased. He requires justice.
The sources bring up Amos's warning about the big religious centers, Bethel and Gilgal.
Oh, Amos's line is just devastating. He essentially screams at them, go to Bethel and sin, go to Gilgal and sin even more.
So the very act of worship was a sin.
The appearance of religious devotion, traveling to these sanctuaries, offering countless sacrifices, was, in the eyes of the covenant, a massive crime because it covered up profound social injustice. It was a failure to live that holy life.
And Isaiah's critique is maybe even more visceral, right? Talking about the stench of the sacrifices.
Isaiah wished someone would just shut the temple doors. He says the smell of the sacrificial animals had become intolerable to God.
Because it was divorced from righteous living.
Totally. It was an institutionalized failure where the king and priest provided a religious endorsement for an unjust society just as long as the rituals were met.
And that institutional failure, the triumph of Stream B ritualism, it had a direct, brutal consequence.
The exile.
A brutal consequence. They literally return to the status of Egyptian slavery, losing the land promised under the covenant.
Which must have forced this deep national intellectual crisis.
Oh, absolutely. They're in Babylon asking, why? Why did this happen? Did God forget us?
And this is where the Deuteronomic historians step onto the scene.
Exactly. These were the theologians tasked with framing Israel's history and providing an answer for the disaster.
So who were they and what did they conclude? Well, they were scholars, religious thinkers, who synthesized the law and all those prophetic warnings. And their answer was crystal clear. We failed because we broke the covenant law.
The book of Deuteronomy itself had already predicted this.
It had. It promised that if they abandoned the law, the land would vomit them out.
And the answer to, how do we get back?
The fix was a passionate return to the law, but now reinterpreted through the lens of Deuteronomy. After they returned to Judea, the exiles were, they were impoverished and powerless.
Right.
They couldn't rebuild a massive, powerful kingdom or some extravagant temple right away. So their focus shifted entirely to the synagogue and the intensive study of the law.
This intense focus on Hebrewism, the deep study of the law, is presented as an intellectual powerhouse.
It really is. That's the intellectual aha moment in the sources.
What do you mean?
Studying the law wasn't seen as just, memorizing 613 commandments. It was the study of the principles and essence of the created world, the deep workings of reality, the very law established at creation.
They were studying the operating manual of the cosmos.
That's a great way to put it. They were looking for the why behind the law.
That's a bold claim.
Yeah.
And the sources suggest this intellectual depth allowed the Jewish community to actually surpass the Hellenistic world, symbolized by Alexandria, which at the time was the world's premier educational city, all within a century.
Yes.
So why was Hebraism considered superior to the best Greek philosophy?
Well, it comes down to scope. Hellenistic philosophy, it dealt with reason and the conceptual world, the philosophical dimension. It was trying to find truth through human logic alone.
Okay.
Hebraism, based on the law, it dealt with the material world, the conceptual world, plus the understanding of God, the theological dimension.
I had a bigger toolkit.
A much bigger one. The law, because it's rooted in creation itself, necessarily included the Creator's design, which is something philosophy just couldn't touch. Hebraism offered a wider, more comprehensive truth.
So they successfully created this powerful intellectual system which dominated its era. Yet later, Judaism still struggled. It fell into those new traps that Job and Jonah critiqued,
All right.
namely the focus on individual transactional reward and the harsh exclusion of outsiders. So this brings us to the final, ultimate question. How does this entire journey of the two streams inform the gospel?
Well, if you look at the traditional view, the one inherited heavily from Stream B, it often contrasts law and gospel.
Right, law versus grace.
Exactly. And it suggests the gospel's primary focus is forgiveness and salvation after death. Take it to heaven.
But the prophetic stream, Stream A, it offers a profoundly different definition of the gospel's purpose.
It speaks to completion. Jesus declared he came not to abolish the law or the prophets, but to complete them.
And completion means?
What?
Completion means realizing the original covenant goal, establishing the holy nation. That life without social distinction, without poverty, without oppression, the very thing Israel had failed to achieve in its historical practice. So the kingdom of God, then, is the ultimate fulfillment of that covenant purpose. It's the restoration of the law on earth.
Exactly. This kingdom is not meant to be solely a post-mortem destination. It is meant to come upon the earth.
Thy kingdom come.
That's it. When Jesus taught us to pray that, it emphasizes the establishment of the kingdom here and now. It's a restoration of the foundational, equitable law of creation into human society.
Which is in stark contrast to the Stream B view, which really pushed salvation and justice into the distant afterlife.
A complete contrast.
What a monumental deep dive. We've seen the entire history of the Old Testament refracted through this single defining conflict.
It's a powerful lens.
You have Stream A, the prophetic tradition focused on justice, equity, the completion of the covenant on earth, versus Stream B, the tradition of ritual, temple focus, and the collusion of power, which ultimately led to Israel's failure.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this analysis really reveals a choice that continues to define religious and even civic structures today. Well, these two streams of emphasis, justice and ritual, they continue to inform how modern communities approach knowledge, power, and faith. This reevaluation of history shows us that even deeply revered models, like King David, must be viewed through this practical lens of covenant justice versus institutional ritual.
Which raises our final question for you to mull over as you reflect on all this information. What stands out to you about which of these two streams? Justice, focus on equity and creation's inherent order, or ritual, focus on ceremony and institutional appeasement, dominates the focus of knowledge and faith communities today.